Good evening and welcome to this second event in this winter semester's GCC keynote lecture series. I would like to thank everyone, first of all, for taking the time right before the winter break. It's a particularly busy time in the semester, and we really appreciate it that you took the time to join. To welcome also our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Stefan Lorenz Sorgner from the University John Cabot, who is going to share part of his work with us tonight on politics, religion, and variants of transhumanism. And we're all very much looking forward to hear more about philosophy, post, I'm assuming, and transhumanism, and possibly also conceptualizations of values. And we're particularly looking forward to get to know Professor Sorgner a bit more, who grew up not far from here. And has also spent some time at JLU, both as a student and as a scholar, and whose fascination with Nietzsche, philosophy, and culture studies has led to a truly international career. So many thanks again, Professor Sorgner, for accepting our invitation and for joining us tonight. In a second, I'll be joined by our colleague and doctoral researcher, Alexander Talovich, who will elaborate a bit further on the context of the invitation. But before I hand over to him for a short introduction of our speaker, allow me to add, as I usually do, just a brief note on the format of tonight's event. Directly after the lecture, we invite questions and comments from you all in the audience, both online and offline. For those who are joining us online during the Q&A, if you would like to pose a question or make a comment, please feel free to enter a plus in the chat and we'll be happy to add you to the list. If you prefer, however, you may also just write your question and comment and directly into the chat and we'll be happy to read it out. Tonight's event, I should mention, will be recorded. The recording, however, as always, is limited to the audio and video of our presenters, and the recording does not include any of the Q&A session, neither does it include any metadata regarding the participants of the session. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Talovich, who is going to share some words of introduction.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kugele. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Stefan Lorenz Sorgner. Professor Sorgner is widely recognized for a philosophical trajectory that combines conceptual precision with sustained public relevance. His work moves confidently from classical questions in metaphysics and Nietzsche scholarship to the ethical, political, and cultural implications of human enhancement. Throughout this trajectory, transhumanism is neither celebrated as a techno-utopia nor dismissed as a speculative fantasy. Instead, it is treated as a serious philosophical problem, one that forces us to rethink normativity, power, and the conditions under which the human continues to be negotiated. Professor Sorgner is Professor of Philosophy at John Cabot University in Rome. He is Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Posthuman Studies, published by Penn State University Press, and co-founder of the Beyond Humanism Network. Across these and various other roles, his work has helped shape international debates at the intersection of philosophy, ethics, and emerging technologies, precisely at a point where philosophical rigor must remain intact while engaging broader publics. A defining feature of Professor Sorgner's intellectual contribution is his insistence on plurality and anti-paternalism in theory and practice. He approaches transhumanism not as a single doctrine, but as a field of heterogeneous positions, moral vocabularies, and institutional imaginaries. This is especially important because public discourse still tends to oscillate between two redacted images. Transhumanism is a tech-driven eschatology promising limitless enhancement, or transhumanism, a dystopian hype of superhuman domination. Both images are rhetorically powerful, yet both obscure what is philosophically and politically at stake. This brings us to today's lecture, Politics, Religion, and Variants of Transhumanism. Rather than asking whether transhumanism should simply be endorsed or rejected, Professor Sorgner invites us to examine how different political systems, cultural traditions, and religious frameworks inform and reveal the specific facets of transhumanism that become socially plausible, institutionally supported, or publicly contested. From this perspective, transhumanism appears not as a far-fetched, detached script, but as a present constellation of ethical orientations, policy debates, and collective imaginaries. An important horizon of this discussion is Professor Sorgner's concept of Euro-transhumanism, which is developed systematically in his forthcoming monograph. This approach is grounded not only in political considerations, but also in European continental philosophy, particularly its critical engagement with metaphysics, subjectivity, and universal norms. Euro-transhumanism raises the question of how enhancement technologies might be embedded with traditions of human rights, social responsibility, and democratic accountability, rather than being left either to technocratic enthusiasm or to market-driven imperatives. Today, then, we are not simply being introduced to transhumanism as a theory, we are being invited to reflect on how enhancement discourses circulate between politics, religion, and culture, and how they reshape contemporary understandings of freedom, responsibility, and human dignity. With this in mind, I would like to invite Professor Sorgner to share his reflection. Please.
Many thanks for these kind words, this wonderful introduction. I'm really happy about all the excellent research you're doing in the field of post-human philosophy, really. I mean, this has been sort of the a strong goal of mine for a long time, to raise academic awareness of the field of post-human studies. Sort of actually, I mean, I've been dealing with, let me just open the journal, which was just mentioned. Journal of Post-Human Studies, because this has really been a launching pad, which is coming out with Penn State University Press. Here you can see the journal. So yes, I've been dealing with issues related to post-human studies now for more than 25 years. Actually, I initially came across sort of the issues with Peter Sloterdijk's infamous speech, Rules for the Human Zoo, which brought about an intense debate concerning the use of gene technologies. So, because my background was on the one hand was Nietzsche studies, on the other hand I dealt a lot with applied ethical issues, so bioethical, gene technologies, AI, and basically these were two unrelated fields. And with the speech by Peter Sloterdijk, he basically brought these two fields together. And in addition, as part of the lecture, he also addressed sort of Nietzschean breeding fantasies, a very German ideology, and he associated these two descriptions basically with a post-humanism which was turned into a naturalist version. What he actually meant was transhumanism, but basically, so he made me aware of the entire debates, and I started to deal with these issues. And then there was Jürgen Habermas basically replying to Peter Sloterdijk in a text on liberal eugenics, and in there he cited Peter Sloterdijk, but he never mentioned the name of Peter Sloterdijk. So this has really triggered the fame of that type of approach in German language discourse. And since then, I've basically been enormously engaged in bringing these two fields together, also in critical post-humanism, in transhumanism, in meta-humanism. But in the academic debate for a long period of time, basically, no one was really interested in it. And whenever I talked about these issues in the beginning of the 2000s, basically, most people said, well, this is something maybe young people do that who've been sitting in front of the computer too long. That's not a serious academic enterprise. That's not. Is there even a journal? And so since 2009, well, I started an annual conference series dedicated the Beyond Humanism conference series, and we've had, artists, we've had ethicists, we've had legal scholars, leading people in the world, scholars of the post-human. That was 2009 when I started the Beyond Humanism conference series, and I thought, well, we need to have a journal. So we got a couple of friends together. In particular, Übermensch University in Seoul, with whom I've been cooperating for a long time. And so in the end, we received four offers from really prestigious publishing houses. In the end, we decided to go with Penn State University Press. And since 2017, it's coming out in print and online twice a year. And so I'm the founding editor-in-chief. And as you can see, sort of in the editorial board, it is the who is who in the field of the post-human. Sort of from critical post-human, we've got Karen Barat, Rosie Braidotti. You know, in the field of AI, Luciano Floridi is really a leading figure. Sociology, Steve Fuller, Catherine Hales, Eduardo Kutsch is a very famous artist, the one who created the fluorescent bunny, Albert the fluorescent bunny, also sent a couple of works of his to the ISS space station. Julian Savulescu, a student of Peter Singer, who used to be head of the Uhira Center in Oxford. Gianni Vattimo, who's my teacher, as well as Wolfgang Welsch. I'm a student of both of them. Kevin Warwick. So we also get engineers. So really bringing together people from different fields related to the post-human, who have basically, in order to live the academic intellectual exchange on this field, because basically was related to non-duality, related to the challenges of emerging technologies. That's where the most groundbreaking challenges arise. And, you know, not one scholar in one field can basically find a proper reply to all of them. We need the best, you know, minds of our generation to get together, because it's an enormous amount of challenges which are being brought about as a consequence of in particular related to emerging technologies, but also related to thinking non-duality. And so since 2020, 1920, with Eva University, we started an MH PhD program related to post-human studies. Now we've got a doctoral thesis here related to the field of post-human studies as well, bringing a wonderful survey of the entire debate. So we're moving along, and it's really well deserved. And I'm wondering, sort of, how many of you have actually dealt with transhumanism, heard a lot about transhumanism? I'm curious, hope you don't mind me. Who knows a bit more about transhumanism? Yeah. No. That's sort of quite sort of representative in a way. And I'm going to try to convince you today. Actually, I will show you that anyone needs to have dealt with transhumanism. It's of utter, you know, political, religious relevance today, cultural relevance today. No matter which stance you have concerning transhumanism, you know, at least you need to be aware of what is happening, how powerful, how impactful it currently is. And in addition, the second issue I'm trying to show you today is basically those who basically think about specific understanding. When transhumanism comes to mind, it is just like Superman on Viagra or Wonder Woman on Botox. That's probably, you know, when quite a few people hear that for the first time, or when they hear it, when they haven't dealt with it so much, that's what many people have in mind. And I want to stress, well, this is not really what transhumanism is all about. It represents one specific stream which does exist and which is politically enormously influential. However, there's a great diversity of different approaches of transhumanism. So it's not a monolith. And I will highlight some different branches which go along with transhumanism. And so, you know, these differences matter and they need to be distinguished. In general, transhumanism is a cultural, basically the idea that affirms the use of technologies in order to move beyond our current limitations. You know, in order to increase the likelihood of us turning into posthumans. That's sort of a general understanding which all transhumanists have in mind. And then, you know, what that exactly means, what the posthuman is, that's an open question, and there are many different answers being given. I'm particularly highlighting, that's also the title of my new book, as it was mentioned, sort of a Euro-transhumanism, which, by the way, does not affirm a Eurocentrism. Euro-transhumanism merely highlights my European situatedness, and I'm you know, related to Spinoza, Nietzsche, Heraclitus. So I'm merely describing the situatedness, and I think sort of the European discourse, the European tradition, has something incredibly important to contribute also to that, to the discourses on transhumanism, which have been dominated by the Anglo-American world. In any case, transhumanism is probably the most paradigm-shifting idea in the world. it undermines the currently dominant understanding of who we are as humans for the past 2,500 years. Basically, in the past 2,500 years, we had the understanding, humans consist of an immaterial mind and a material body. That's sort of that binary framing which has dominated our cultural history. Not only the past, it is still the case today. And I'm regularly highlighting, probably at the beginning of most of my classes, in order to stress, look, even today, many people think, well, we've moved beyond such an understanding. If you look at the constitutions all over the world, in all the constitutions, only humans are seen as persons. Animals are things, or in Germany, they're supposed to be treated like things, like objects. So that there's a category of the human and there's a category of the rest, the others. And that already implies basically that Judeo-Christian tradition, which has dominated the Western understanding, which can be traced in the end to someone like Plato, and Christianity can be seen as Platonism for the people. And sort of Darwin has moved beyond. Then there were Nietzsche, there was Freud, and basically sort of all the great range of different discourses related to the post-human do take that revised understanding, non-dualistic understanding of the human seriously. We are completely embedded in the world, and so, we came about as human beings about 300,000 years ago as a consequence of a genetic mutation, and then we basically got upgraded by learning language, because then, as a consequence of the genetic mutation, we have developed the capacity of learning, of developing a language. And the question is sort of, where will we be in 300,000 years' time, or in 6 million years' time? 6 million years in the past, we had the last common ancestors who was great apes. Where will we be? Will humans be around? And the likelihood is high. The world is so dynamic, and we are constantly shifting, and we're constantly changing ourselves. So either we will have died out, or we will have developed further. So it's very unlikely that any species stays the same. So it's a very dynamic understanding, and this dynamism is not sufficiently taken for granted in most philosophies, actually, not only philosophies. So we need, in order to do so, we need to significantly move beyond our current boundaries. We need to develop further. And we used to rely on natural selection. And now, in particular, with the great variety of technologies, we can take responsibility in our hands. We can more and more influence who we want to be. And the transhumanist reply is basically, yeah, we should do so. It's good that we should do so. We can do so, and why we should do so by making a decision and promoting these capacities by means of technologies. We increase the capacity, we increase the likelihood of us living good lives. And that's the fundamental goal, basically, which is being shared by transhumanism. The word transhumanism can be traced, by the way, to the Divine Comedy by Dante. So he was the one who first coined the term transhumanar. Obviously, it had a completely different meaning. He referred to some process in the immaterial afterworld, and that has nothing to do with transhumanism. There was someone else. There were some other people in the 1940s who actually used the word transhumanism. But again, all of them meant it in a Christian context, and they referred to some otherworldly processes. So the first person who ever used the term transhumanism in an imminent, non-dualist, evolutionary manner is Julian Huxley. And he did so in a lecture in 1951. The lecture was published actually in 1951 as well. In most texts you will find 1957, but 1957 he published a book which is entitled New Bottles for New Wine. There he basically reprinted the article which was already published in 1951. He also, in the book in 1957, he also coined the term, he also employed the term evolutionary humanism. So evolutionary humanism and transhumanism are very similar notions. Julian Huxley, for those who don't know him so well, he was the first general director of the UNESCO, he was involved in structuring the Universal Charter of Human Rights. So in the discussion which took place before they were established, he was strongly involved in formulating them. He was also the president of the British Eugenics Society. His entire family was basically deeply entangled in the evolutionary, in the development of the theory of evolution. Aldous Huxley, his brother, he wrote the great utopian novel, Brave New World. Then his half-brother, or his grandfather, was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, and his half-brother was the Nobel Prize winner Henry Fielding Huxley. Henry Fielding Huxley, like Julian Huxley, they were both professors of biology at the University of London. But not so many people remember Henry Fielding Huxley nowadays. So, if you don't win the Nobel Prize, it's not so important. If you make a great contribution, on the other hand, you're still being talked about. But he really had an impact on culture with basically developing that notion. In addition, what I already promised was, so he founded the term, he coined the term initially, and he developed it. And it's important so that there's a great variety of different types of transhumanism. It's not the faster, higher, better understanding, which is so widely shown in the medium. In particular, so that was a foundational transhumanism. Then in addition, there's an original transhumanism, which can basically be related to Max More, Natasha Vita-More, FM 2030. These were sort of the futurists. Max More actually studied philosophy, first in Oxford, then in California. They were futurists, they were active, they were trying to push the notion in the public debates. And they should be related to original transhumanism. They are, again, a different understanding than the foundational. For example, they're libertarian, whereas Julian Huxley was social democratic, as one example. But he was against perfectionism, Max More and the others. So it's also very different from what many people associate with transhumanism today. And so one of the texts actually which I would like to highlight, Max More, what he wrote in 1990, Transhumanism Towards a Futurist Philosophy. There's a wonderful reader, posthuman studies reader, which basically collects, that was edited by Jan Stasienko and Evi Sampaniko, and they've done a wonderful job basically bringing together the classic texts, both from transhumanism as well as from critical posthumanism, in order to get an insight for the differences for these two movements. So Max More was critical of perfectionism, critical of utilitarianism, as well as utopia. He affirms the virtue ethical approach and politically supports libertarianism. As the third approach, and this is probably the approach, not only probably, this is the approach which definitely had the biggest impact on our society, on culture, because there was a close connection basically with many leading agents in Silicon Valley, leading entrepreneurs. The richest and most politically active people nowadays have been influenced by that classic transhumanism. In 1998, Nick Bostrom and David Pierce founded the World Transhumanist Association. From 2005 till 2024, Bostrom was the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford, which was largely responsible for developing classic transhumanism. There's also approaches like the long-termism and many other really problematic approaches which are widely shared among entrepreneurs in the US have been developed there. This philosophical approach defends utilitarianism. That's the only approach which actually highlights utilitarianism. Often one identifies transhumanism with utilitarianism, but it's actually just primarily Bostrom who does so. Perfectionism. He has very rigid ideas concerning perfectionism, like the Vitruvian man on steroids, basically. But again, this is a notion which primarily he shares, not the rest of the transhumanists. And he also highlights the relevance of utopias. And these ideas had a strong impact on Silicon Valley entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who donated £1 million British pounds to the Future of Humanity Institute in 2015. He contributed also a blurb to Bostrom's bestseller Superintelligence. And he popularized many of Bostrom's ideas, like the simulation hypothesis, sort of basically the idea that chances are high that we're already living in a computer simulation, which is then taken up in, in the movies like Transcendence and Netflix series, Altered Carbon or Black Mirror and so on. So actually most of, when I give talks at high schools, most of the students have heard at least the ideas which are associated with them, but even if they haven't heard about transhumanism. And sort of the fourth approach is sort of Euro-transhumanism, and it crystallized at the latest, at least, with the publication of my article, Nietzsche, the Overhuman and Transhumanism, which I published in 2009. And that sort of triggered a lot of strong responses, both among Nietzsche scholars as well as among transhumanists. Sort of the Nietzsche scholars said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with transhumanism. Some said, no, that's fine. No, there actually is a structural ideology. But most said, no, we don't want to play with them. And the same was the transhumanists. They said, no, we don't want to play with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is like the fascist, eugenics, that's the bad guy. Which is not the case, actually. This is far from true, from any nuanced reading concerning Nietzsche. However, Bostrom, for example, said, no, Nietzsche was not an ancestor of transhumanism. Whereas Max Moore, he directly replied to sort of the essay I wrote, and he said, no, I can confirm what Sorgner said. I myself was strongly influenced by Nietzsche. So there is quite a strong influence by Nietzsche on transhumanism. And sort of this tradition draws upon Heraclitus, Spinoza, Goethe, Wagner, and Nietzsche. It's anti-libertarian, it is anti-utilitarian, anti-perfectionist, anti-utopian, and highlights the relevance of incorporating emerging technologies so that a great diversity of different lifestyles can be realized, as was mentioned in the introduction. And there are quite a few scholars and artists, Sven Helbig, there Johanna Kroszowska, there are people like Ricardo Campa, who are also working, who regard themselves as Euro-transhumanists. How is transhumanism now received in the 21st century? So I already mentioned for Germany, what was very important was basically that it was mentioned in the Regeln für den Menschenbau, Rules for the Human Suit, from 1999. That's also when I first became aware of transhumanism. Then Jürgen Habermas, in 2001, he derided the movement in these reflections on liberal eugenics. So he referred to them as freaked out intellectuals, self-styled Nietzscheans with all too familiar motives of a very German ideology. But the intellectual relevance was highlighted. And then he realized actually that was 2001, so 12 years later, he actually wrote about transhumanism again. And then he said, well, he said he was happy that, it's only like a bunch of fringe intellectuals to deal with. But that was no longer the case in 2013. So he said, well, that's actually a sect. That was then his try of, undermining the reputation of transhumanism. Of course, there's no prayer, there are no rituals, it's really an absurd accusation. Transhumanism really became famous international in 2004 when Francis Fukuyama, the advisor of Bush at the time, of the American president, he was asked, what's the world's most dangerous idea? And the response was transhumanism. And he published a 3-page piece in the Foreign Policy magazine. And thereby a wider intellectual engagement with transhumanism was realized. Then in 2013, Dan Brown published the international best-selling novel Inferno, with which the public reception of transhumanism has been initialized. So I'm not normally a Dan Brown reader, but this is a book actually, it's very entertaining, as his novels are. And he actually, why I'm mentioning it is, it actually refers to the World Transhumanist Association. It actually deals with real-life figures and events from transhumanism, and the entire plot is structured around transhumanism. And it's actually very intriguing. The idea is a very intriguing idea. It's about a mad scientist who's a transhumanist, and then he creates an airborne virus, and he threatens to release the virus. But what the virus does is it because it's a transhumanist, bad guy, scientist. What the virus does is the scientist sees overpopulation as the greatest challenge. And so the virus makes sure that always a third of the world's population becomes infertile. And as a consequence of that, he wants to stop overpopulation. That was the idea, which I thought was, it's a very intriguing, of course it's morally, highly problematic, but it's a very intriguing idea to deal with the issue of overpopulation. I was already happy when that was turned into a movie, but it was turned into a Hollywood movie, and then from what was said in the Dan Brown movie, it didn't like make a third of the population infertile, but it killed a third of your population. So it was a really terrible. I was so disappointed when that came out. Don't watch the movie. Read the book. And then basically a lot of transcendence, the Johnny Depp movie, where actually Elon Musk was a part of. Many of the Netflix series also were shown in the 2010s. The next big step concerning the reception of transhumanism in the 21st century was in July 2024. Elon Musk created the America PAC, the Political Action Committee, support the political campaign of Donald Trump. The organization was backed by many other billionaires, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and infamous companies like Palantir, spearheaded by Peter Thiel, well, most people, I guess, know. And from then on, this shows sort of the political relevance of a specific type of transhumanism, of classic transhumanism. And I really strongly need to highlight it. It's only one specific approach which can be traced to the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, which basically had that impact on Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. So the final stage reveals now the political relevance of transhumanism today. And it also entered basically American politics. And we see what is happening in American politics right now. It is, very, very sad to see it. And within the US American politics, there's a strong pro-transhumanism strain within the Trump administration. And in particular, it is related to the Palantir co-founder, Peter Thiel. He was a major donor of Vance's 2022 Senate campaign in Ohio. And Vance also worked for Thiel's venture capital firm, Mitrial Capital. In 2021, Thiel was also responsible for realizing a meeting between Vance and Trump, which made him become Trump's running mate. Because we all know sort of Vance was very critical of Trump before. And then it seems that in the background, there was Thiel basically I can get you, you have potential. He talked to him, do apologize to Trump. He brought them together. And we all see what had happened afterwards. He's now the vice president. And in 3 years' time, chances are not small that he'll become the next president of the United States. But in the background, it was Thiel basically bringing them together. And Vance had already worked for the venture capitalist firm of Thiel. Thiel and Musk, they led separate companies which later merged to PayPal. It was not they co-founded, because it was like there were separate companies who basically had something to contribute, which made both of them billionaires. And both of them embrace an aspect of transhumanism. They don't they're very aware of the public perception, but basically the ideas they pursue are transhumanism. It becomes particularly clear with Musk really inviting Future of Humanity scholars to secret islands with him, donating money and supporting them. And all the ideas can be traced to the classic transhumanist context. Musk, but they affirm a different type of transhumanism. Musk is particularly interested in existential risk, and basically, what are the greatest risks that humans that could lead to human extinction, like wars and viruses and so on, or earthquakes, and so or AI, and that's what he regularly highlights. On the other hand, Thiel is particularly interested in increasing our health span. It's sort of that element, which is that's the only element which is concerning the good life, which is shared by most, if not all, serious transhumanists. He's donated significant sums to the SENS Research Foundation, an outgrowth from the Methuselah Foundation. Aubrey de Grey, the guy with the long beard, he's a scientist who basically gerontologist, something. Either he's a genius or he's someone who really made it by telling an interesting story. But he changed people thinking about aging, and because he highlighted that aging is a disease, and he related that to seven different processes why aging should be seen as a disease, and that has an enormous impact on the research culture in biology, biotechnology, and so on, in many different fields. So Jim O'Neill and Peter Thiel. So it was Thiel establishing the Thiel Foundation, but Jim O'Neill was organizing this research foundation. He was running it. He co-founded the Thiel Foundation, and probably no one here has heard of Jim O'Neill. However, it's I assume maybe you have, but he's not that well known. But he is someone actually to look out for. So Jim O'Neill, he ran the Thiel Foundation. And this Thiel and the Thiel Foundation gives away money to the Thiel Fellowship, and basically where people receive $100,000 per year for 2 years in order to drop out of university. If you've got an idea, create the new unicorn, become a billionaire, and I want to support you with that. And he's actually realized that with quite a few people, like Austin Russell. Lucy Guo last year was the youngest female self-made billionaire. She was 30 when she became one. She was a recipient. Vitalik Buterin, I met him 10 years ago. Vitalik Buterin, we were together in South Korea. That was a week before he launched his product, and his product was Ethereum, the second most successful cryptocurrency. And he is basically the number one in blockchain technologies nowadays. Nowadays I think he was like 21, so nowadays he should be 31. He's given like more than $300 million to also anti-aging research, and he takes his ideas very seriously and does actually strongly involved in promoting them. So, the Thiel Foundation, Jim O'Neill and Peter Thiel. Jim O'Neill, who was running this Thiel Foundation, also served as a CEO of the SENS Research Foundation from 2019 to 2021. And the SENS Research Foundation is dedicated to the work of Aubrey de Grey, which basically says, no, aging is a disease which needs to be cured. And Jim O'Neill, now, he was sworn in by Kennedy, the current Secretary of Health. On the 9th of June, 2025, he became the United States Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration. So he's a number 2 under Kennedy. And you can see all that. It's the running mate Vance. It is with Vitalik Buterin. It is now Jim O'Neill, who becomes the Vice Secretary of Health. And they all prepare basically, when Vance will take over, Thiel is still the man in the background. He's basically realized, his importance is enormous. On the other hand, so this is a pro-transhumanist strand within the Trump administration. On the other hand, there's also, these are the more conservative but they have some openness. They want best minds for their companies, of course. But then that's why there's also the MAGA movement, which is even more conservative. And here there's a strong anti-transhumanist strain because they, don't want any foreigners in, it seems. They just want to prefer, local community values within the United States. So Steve Bannon is there, the leading figure still, and he used to be advisor to Trump for a long time. He's still very influential in the MAGA movement. And he wrote in 2023, the book came out, Dark Aeon, which was an introduction to transhumanism, very successful introduction to transhumanism, written by a journalist, commissioned by Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon personally, he also wrote the preface to the book, Dark Aeon. Bannon recently highlighted Elon Musk as an evil person. In the preface, now the former White House chief strategist agrees with the substance of Francis Fukuyama, the criticism that transhumanism is the world's most dangerous idea. But he stresses it goes much further. He says the practice is far worse than the theory. According to him, transhumanist developments are in the interest of the world's elite corporate overlords, and the global institutions of finance, Wall Street, and Davos are behind the latest aberration of humanity. And so, as one can also already see in the wording of his criticism, Steve Bannon's criticism also contains anti-Semitic connotations. It's basically is anti-Semitism. These are the Jewish world leaders coming together, taking over the world. That's basically what Steve Bannon is saying. That's how he refers to how he sees transhumanism. And Bannon is still a significant voice within the Trump's MAGA movement and a key informal advisor of Trump's inner circle. So we've seen in the States with anti-transhumanism and pro-transhumanism within the Trump camp. And interestingly, something similar can be seen in Russia. In Russia, there's also the global anti-transhumanism coalition, which connects the United States with Russia and Brazil. In Russia, the leading thinker and protagonist is Alexander Dugin, and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill I, the patriarch of Moscow. And they've both organized anti-transhumanist events. They've published a lot of books against transhumanism. Dugin explicitly calls transhumanism the idea of the devil. So it's basically his idea is sort of the orthodox truths on the other hand, and then there is pluralism. All these discussing like liberty, pluralism, democracy, LGBTQIA, all the evils in the world, according to him, which are being summarized by transhumanism. He identifies all of that explicitly with transhumanism, and so it's the orthodox truths against all these evils in the world. That's how Dugin conceptualizes the world. I found myself actually on the website of the German publishing house publishing Dugin's books, basically saying, "Look, that's a German representative of transhumanism." That's it. So Bannon and Dugin met personally in Rome in 2018 to discuss philosophical ideas related to traditionalism, an approach which rejects modernity and its ideals. And this outlook is also shared by Olavo de Carvalho. Olavo de Carvalho is a political guru or the intellectual behind the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. So they are friends. It's the advisor of Bolsonaro, Bannon, Dugin. They share that traditionalist outlook. And traditionalism basically means, the ideal is something like a medieval Christianity, a hierarchical Christianity, which they affirm. And even the Enlightenment is already a way away from, a movement away from such an ideal. So rejection of the Enlightenment. And that's what they have in mind. And all of them say, no, look, transhumanism that's the idea of the devil. On the other hand, we also see in Russia something else, namely the eldest daughter of Vladimir Putin, Maria Vorontsova. She is now publicly positioned as a major scientist with a world-class laboratory after winning a state-funded grant from the Russian Science Foundation. She's a physician, and the grant supports her latest project, regulation of cell renewal processes in the body, the fundamental basis for long-term preservation of functional activity of organs and tissues, human health, and active longevity. And in fact, its focus is anti-aging. And prolonging the health span is a central goal which is being upheld in transhumanism. The relevance of longevity is highlighted by both Putin as well as by Xi Jinping. In September 2025, there was this meeting, and some left left the microphones on, and they were, the Russian leader was caught musing about immortality with Xi Jinping, but his fascination with long life is nothing new. Actually, I think Xi Jinping was not so happy about this recording, and afterwards he contacted, I think it was Reuters, and sort of don't share that information don't continue to share that information. He didn't like that, actually, this gets. And they would talk, we can change all the organs, bioprint, we'll all become 150 or older. So that's a strong fascination in Russia too. And the focus on anti-aging and longevity is actually, that's probably the most flourishing field of transhumanism today. And I do agree. I mean, this is, I think aging is a disease. I think that it actually is something we need to take care of. The question is how it should be structured. And I think sort of anti-aging research is, most people from transhumanism are now turning towards the field of anti-aging research, besides the ones who focus on existential risk and relating that to AI and so on. And here the key player, the key global player when it comes to anti-aging is the Vitalik Buterin, the one who received the Thiel Fellowship and who basically the man who created Ethereum. He founded the second biggest cryptocurrency. It was launched in 2015. He received the Thiel Fellowship in 2014, which enabled him to do so. And he launched the pop-up city of Sudzala in Montenegro in 2023, which has played a significant role in the development of Italia, a decentralized city focused on longevity and biotech innovation, located in Prospera Special Economic Zone, Roatan, Honduras. Many of you might have heard of that Honduras of Roatan. It's basically because this is where Brian Johnson, I'm sure quite a few have seen, my students have seen. Brian Johnson, the documentary where he basically, the millionaire, where he did, in order to cure his own disease, the gene modification, in order to get stop aging or get younger. This happened in Roatan, in this special economic zone. Honduras, why there? Then why Montenegro? Of course, these are places with some unclear, not so clear rights-based political system where things can happen which would otherwise not happen within the European Union. And where people can try out risky things, biohacking, try things out, and they bring leading scientists, artists, thinkers together to live together for 2 months, 1 month, 2.5 months, never longer than 3 months. Why not never longer than 3 months? Because it's a cryptocurrency community is enormously big, and they are supporting the field because they've made multimillionaires and billionaires as a consequence, and they want to keep the money as long as possible. So they invest a lot in anti-aging research, and they cannot stay longer than 3 months in one country, because if they stay longer than 3 months, they are obliged to pay taxes in the country. That's also why they don't buy any property. Once you buy property, so it's a completely legal way of avoiding taxes. But on the other hand, they love to hang out with like-minded people, so they invite the leading research, David Sinclair, like the leading a medical scholar from Harvard Medical School, who also sees aging as a disease. He flies them in basically to these places, pop-up cities all over the world, where people meet up in order, to create a new unicorn, create a new company, live together, live their classic transhumanist ideal. That also goes along with sort of a very, very, very radical hedonist ideals, what is being promoted there. So Aubrey de Grey, the guy who sees aging as a disease, he was also there. He was removed from his position as chief science officer at the Sands Research Foundation following allegations of sexual harassment in August 21. He basically said, to the young girls who are part of that, look, you need to sleep with the old investors because we're part of a war. We are a war against aging, and that's the strongest war. And we need to get, like in a war, you need to sacrifice yourselves in order to get money from the aging old investors. And sort of that's being promoted. It's really also about, fly around the world, have a good time, in a very base hedonist way. So in these pop-up cities, they've got like workshops on SM with changing partners. They've got tantra sex workshops. They've got polyamory workshops. It's really focused on a very base hedonism, which goes along with classic transhumanism. So Buterin also counts as an influential facilitator within local innovation system. In Chiang Mai, in Thailand, again, the same thing happened. A further hub for longevity research workshops on topics including defensive accelerated decentralization, stablecoins, AI, biotech. They are all being organized in interactive pop-up cities like the Edge City Lana, which took place in Chiang Mai in the fall of 2024. And there's a global trend in the crypto communities to support anti-aging communities. All of that is related. This is an outgrowth of the thought of classic transhumanism, which had an enormous impact there. On the other hand, but that's one specific approach, and there are many different types of transhumanism. There's also the Europe transhumanism I mentioned. That can be traced to the 2009 publication of my article, and the classic transhumanism was culturally, economically, and politically most dominant form of transhumanism, belongs to the Anglo-American tradition and affirms basically utilitarianism. Euro-transhumanism, on the other hand, is rooted in continental European traditions. And let me just highlight, in order to show just the difference between sort of a Euro-transhumanist approach and something which is dominant in classic transhumanism, sort of how different these approaches are. While both affirm, we need to overcome our personal limitations, and also by means of new technologies, because thereby we actually can increase the likelihood of living a good life. So classic transhumanism upholds several versions of utopias, like long-termism. Long-termism, that's also the idea. Look, climate change is not a big issue. Even if 95%, 99% of the people die out, as long as 1% of the rich, white, intelligent men survive, they get to regenerate, and then in the future there will be many more other people, and that's what really matters. That's sort of the idea underlying Elon Musk, and that's now part of the Future of Humanity Institute. Euro-transhumanism rejects the affirmation of any utopia due to the paternalistic and potentially totalitarian implication, the strong reaction of any type of utopia. Classic transhumanism affirms a hyper-Renaissance ideal of perfection. What I mentioned, it's really the Vitruvian man to be realized by means of emerging technologies. The Euro-transhuman embraces a radical plurality of concepts of the good life, whereby the right of morphological freedom becomes central. Also the right to use these new technologies, but not in order to affirm one specific ideal, but basically, to develop the capacities and qualities we want to develop and we want to realize, no matter what they are. Classic transhumanism presents an optimistic understanding of the world. Suffering is an issue, we can get rid of suffering. The hedonist imperative, David Pearce. Euro-transhumanism adheres to a Buddhist understanding of dukkha, due to us having wants, desires, longings, which informs philosophical pessimism. That's coming from Schopenhauer and Nietzsche tradition. We're suffering, and we'll continue. That's our basic state. And you know what? And it's not like a complete realization and getting rid of all the challenges, but by means of emerging technologies, we can actually successfully deal with a lot of sufferings. We can successfully deal with a lot of problems, and that's a great thing. And I do want to say, just like 200 years ago, we had an absolute poverty rate of more than 90% all over the world. Even in the UK, it was more than 80%. Now it went down to 10% globally. And I think that's a great thing. Or just like the average life expectancy 200 years ago was 40 years, and now it's more than 80 years. And that's a wonderful development. And we shouldn't, that's also why I do affirm the use of technology. The problem is sort of the political outlook and the rest which goes along with it. Classic transhumanism claims a certain philosophical insight as well as norms. They are objectively and universally valid. Euro-transhumanism regards philosophical perspectivism with the Nietzschean heritage as the most plausible way to interpret philosophical and ethical judgment. That's also a way of avoiding neocolonial implications. Classic transhumanism affirms a version of ethical Utilitarianism, we've seen that in the long-termism approach. It's really about calculating outputs and maximizing consequences. E.t. Transhumanism favors a hermeneutic ethics that's more considerate of the cultural context. Classic transhumanism argues it's strongly libertarian, and we've seen that we've seen that in every day with Thiel and Musk and everyone. It's also being affirmed on a theoretical level, and classic transhumanism is basically the affirmation of a social liberal democracies, and in order to promote human flourishing. It's wonderful that we have, really what we have, and this universal health insurance, which we have in the European Union. That's an amazingly wonderful achievement. And we really need to be proud of that, of what goes along with that. And we shouldn't make ourselves too small. I've got many students coming over from the United States because they've got medical preconditions. They can't take out our health insurance. They need to come to Italy to study here in order to be insured. And even like concerning life expectancy in the United States, there's a life expectancy which is 4 or 5 years lower than in the European Union, even though the medical technologies which are available in the United States are much better. If you've got a very rare case of cancer, it would be better to get treated. You don't get treatment in Europe, but you would get treated. You could get a treatment in various places in the United States. So, but still, for the average life expectancy is 4 or 5 years lower, because if you don't have the money, then you die. So classic transhuman aims for the realization of immortality. Eurotranshuman identifies an increase of the health span as the best way to promote the quality of human life. Immortality, many talk about immortality. I mean, we cannot even conceptualize immortality. Look, if you embrace a naturalist worldview, you've got like a big bang and expansion, then it comes either to a cosmological standstill, or it comes to, the cosmological singularity. But even, how should even an uploaded mind survive? That's absurd. I mean, that's seriously absurd. So forget about immortality. But like an increased health span, I think that's a great thing. Classic transhumanism claims that mind uploading will be possible in a few decades. They focus on a silicon-based transhumanism. Eurotranshumanism stresses that we've always been cyborgs. That's the title of another book of mine. Which, due to us being psychophysiological entities, renders it highly unlikely that the singularity is near, which is more an affirmation of a carbon-based transhumanism. And all these ideas with mind uploading, and us in superintelligence, putting us into humans into a zoo, that's being propagated by Bostrom in Superintelligence book. And it was a bestseller. I think it should be sold in the science fiction section. It has absolutely nothing to do with serious science. It shouldn't be dealt with. It is completely science fiction. Classic transhumanism stresses the risk associated with superintelligence. Eurotranshumanism regards it as highly unlikely that artificial intelligence will put humans into a zoo into the near future. That's again superintelligence, even strong intelligence. And we just recently, in the past couple of days, we said there was, I think, a Japanese firm claims to have realized human-like intelligence on an artificial basis. It is not. It just can't. So strong AI and strong AI claims an AI can do all the jobs, does have all the capacities a human does. Humans, we are alive. We don't have any living digital entity. And now humans have consciousness, have self-consciousness, have intentionality, emotions. I mean, I could give another lectures on, but now we don't. There's maybe in the future, who knows? In a couple, I don't exclude the possibility, but it's not going to happen in the next couple of decades. No, superintelligence is not an existential risk. Will not put us humans into the zoo. Will not take over the world. Superintelligence together with humans, human incorporate. That's a different story, but not superintelligence by itself. But strangely, even really clever people have affirmed that understanding. It's being dealt with all the movies, but it's just not anyone who thinks a little bit cannot regard that as a serious issue. Then that was the tenth. To overcome suffering should be the primary goal, according to classic transhumanism. recognize the inevitability of suffering, enhanced stresses, that we should focus on realistic goals. We need to see with what is an as good as it gets solution, and never aim for any type of utopia, because in any type of utopia, the present and the people alive are being sacrificed for a future which will never come about. Classic transhumanism sees transhumanism in line with the Enlightenment. Euro-transhumanism stresses a more ambiguous relationship to the foundations of the Enlightenment. And that's basically sort of how do we rational immaterial mind? So it's a matter of how do we conceptualize enlightenment. And there are two strong traditions. On the one hand, there's a tradition from Descartes to Kant, which identifies humans with the rational immaterial mind. On the other hand, there's also the tradition which Marquis de Sade and Nietzsche, who have a more embodied non-dualistic understanding, irrational understanding. And that's more strongly connected within transhumanist circles. Also because in transhumanism in general, it's not anthropocentric to the most part. There's classic transhumanists are, but for the most part, they claim personhood for non-human animals. So in the Singer tradition, and that's not anthropocentrism. That means, personhood would be for orangutans and dolphins and so on. So that's a shift away from traditional anthropocentrism. And the 12th point, Euro-transhumanism sees Nietzsche as an ancestor of transhumanism, and classic transhumanism, Bostrom explicitly denies their relevance because, in order to protect his version of transhumanism, but there's nothing to protect it from Nietzsche. Nietzsche was clearly, explicitly an anti-Semite. He was a good European. And so and many of the scholars within the Third Reich also realized, it is not very clever to draw upon Nietzsche. Actually, he doesn't serve a good purpose in that context. So this is sort of, I hope I was able to show you, if you haven't heard of transhumanism so much, it is absolutely relevant. If you're interested in culture and politics and religion, you need to deal with it. And even though there's just the classic transhumanism, which has been amazingly important and influential in politics and entrepreneurial world, there are many different variants, and it's not sufficient to have read two articles by that one guy in order to understand transhumanism. There are many different approaches, and I think it's actually good to affirm several elements of transhumanism, but one doesn't have to have this libertarian, perfection, utopian outlook. There are many other very helpful enterprises, and I think without actually focusing also on the achievements which we have in Europe, and without realizing, without affirming, there's a lot to be gained for. We've got a wonderful, without being a new Eurocentrism, but just also stressing our situationness. I think, and that's what I'm trying to show, but that's strong also in the cultural sciences, just to completely move away from it. But we can move into criticism, we move into debates with the also indigenous cultures, with cultures all over the world, but not trying to sort of undermine it directly. That's why I'm trying to highlight also with the notion of Euro-transhumanism, which will come out in spring next year. So many thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to this.